Hi, so I wanted to talk about the current impasse and meeting between Trump and Zelensky, Vance as well, and try and put my thoughts in a broader context. I think that when you look at this, I was thinking about the fact that with these types of things, we are all, or many of us, engaged and involved with them. And yet, it for all of us, pretty much all of us, we have no influence in the situation. And in a way, it's somewhat like watching a movie that we think might have an impact on our lives, but we're watching a movie for all the influence that we have. And I was thinking about this in the discussions I've been having with people about it recently, in the way that everybody gets very emotionally involved. It's a bit like watching a film and you're shouting at the screen, like, don't turn left, turn right, or, oh no, they're just about to do blah, 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 all of that. So I was reflecting on what's the point of all that we watch, all the dramas that are playing out around us, like the current one over Ukraine and the war there and so on. And I realized that, as in all situations, in our personal lives as well, once you see yourself less in the role of having to do something about everything, you start to appreciate the value of all that's going on around you, in terms of not that you should change it all, but that there is tremendous learning inherent in it. So you're less reactive to it, as if it's all wrong, and you're more appreciating seeing it in the context, the people that come along, the situations that come along, in the context of being perfect for you to see or learn something. And so your focus is more there, rather than taking it quite so personally or reactively. And oh my God, for all of us, that is more than a life's work. None of us are impeccable in that. I'm certainly not. But I think once I am able to do that, my response changes very significantly to it. And I can see at the moment, with the current situation, Trump, Zelensky, Putin, and so on, like in our personal lives, it's very similar to our personal lives. The temptation is to to take sides, to see it in a very tribal manner, and to make very strong moral judgments about it, as if there is a right and a wrong side and a good and an evil, and get caught in all of that. And then you're in a polarized fight of the good against the bad. And I think that, as I've said in previous videos, I'm fascinated by Trump, because I think that he is he's a catalyst for ushering in a new perspective. And so he is stirring things up. In fact, the whole situation is stirring things up. And I think when you stand back and look from that perspective, almost as if it's a wonderful interactive video game or learning game, you start to see that the Ukraine is a fascinating and perfectly set up situation, where Europe and Russia meet, where the tectonic plates of Europe and Russia meet. And as in our personal lives, once you see it more through that lens of what are we learning here? Why is this so perfectly set up to be a point of conflict, a sort of grating point in our life? For all the years that I've coached people, like 30 odd years that I've been coaching people, I began to see that everybody has someone or some situation that they feel, but for that personal situation, my life would go so smoothly. And what I began to reflect on was, no, that person is meant to be there. They are the grit in the oyster that's going to create the pearl, so that in every story we tell, the protagonist, the hero or heroine, always has an antagonist who appears to represent all that they're fighting against. But the protagonist, the hero heroine, can't become wise without the antagonist, without the provocation from the antagonist. So if you think of any story, I mean, I don't know, something like in Harry Potter, Harry Potter's got to have Lord Voldemort because, excuse me, because for Harry Potter, Lord Voldemort is the mechanism by which he is learning about himself. Lord Voldemort is pushing him all the time beyond, out of his comfort zone, beyond where he thinks he can respond. And all those people who could take responsibility for him, Dumbledore, his parents, Sirius, always die or are out of the picture because he has to find it within himself, and he keeps thinking he can't, that it's beyond him, that someone else will do it, that his father's come back or whatever it might be. And yet he in each situation he's stretched, he grows, he develops, he's stretched, and all the Horcruxes in the end are all the things that could corrupt him, are all his false selves. So power, fame, negative thoughts, etc., etc. And he realizes the final Horcrux is in himself. That his real fight is that Voldemort, what you begin to see by the end, that they're connected, that they are the same person, that Voldemort is Harry Potter. Harry Potter is Voldemort. It's part of him, part of his own shadow, that his real fight is with himself. Once he sees that, he's able to let go and give up that part of himself and give up the fight. That's the point. Give up the power battle. When he does that, Voldemort becomes what it always was, which is what he always was, which is a very vulnerable, wounded part of himself, for which he can have compassion or empathy. Same in Lord of the Rings. Same in any story. Our stories are actually always telling us about reality. That's why they exist. Our unconscious creates them. Always the same stories, because they're telling us about reality. They're not just stories, they're reality. And so I think, going back to the situation with Trump and Zelensky and the whole Ukraine situation, the more interesting perspective is, for me, is to try and think, what is the positive intention on everyone's part, rather than judging people as good or bad, or you're on one side or the other. And I think everyone's got terribly caught in this. You can sort of see Trump as a wonderful catalyst for many of our projections and shadow. He's like a cosmic joker, but he's a catalyst for that. And everybody so quickly polarizes and becomes tribal. So I noticed all the European leaders saying, we're on your side, Zelensky. We'll back you against the big baddie, Russia, Putin. And everybody falls into the drama triangle. The persecutor, rescuer, victim narrative. And it's like a school playground. They can't bully you. We're on your side. We'll look after you. And that approach achieves very little. It just separates people. because it comes from a fundamental misunderstanding. And I think the misunderstanding is the heart of what we are evolving towards and why this might be happening. And the fundamental misunderstanding is that we are all one. And if we forget that, if we get identified with any identity, identified with an identity, yeah, I know. So if we get identified with being, I don't know, European or British or Ukrainian or American, then everybody else becomes separate from us. And this comes down to an interesting point about what I think is maybe evolving through all of this, which is that we are coming to terms with the fact that consciousness and this collective, whatever you want to call it, collective experience, collective mind, perhaps, we are all one at that level. When you experience consciousness, it doesn't have an identity. It doesn't even have a personal identity. It's just consciousness. And it's the same in everybody. And once you experience that, you can't see it differently. I always thought it was interesting that the astronauts, when they went up into space initially and saw the Earth, they experienced this thing called the overview phenomena, where they could no longer apparently be part of the military. And the reason for that was because when they got up and saw the Earth from space, they saw that all the divisions and boundaries and national didn't exist. It was all just one planet. And the idea of fighting anybody became pointless and senseless. And it's the same with the world. I think that with the climate crisis, the point of that is not the crisis and to get caught in judgment and blame and goodies and baddies and all of that sort of more tribal mentality, which puts us back in the same place again, but rather to recognize that the value of the climate crisis is that it helps us see, or is provoking us to see, this is just one Earth, one body. All the divisions we create in terms of countries, etc., are simply constructs. And culturally created. And I'm realizing it's the same. It's a very interesting one. It's the same with this situation in the Ukraine, where actually it's provoking all of us to see that we're all one. To see that these fights we're having about countries' identities divide and separate us. And I remember my very wise friend, my teacher, who would always say to me when I was trying to deal with difficult conflicts, when I was chairman of a charity, of a school, a Steiner school, she would say to me, the only way through the conflict is to be on everyone's side equally. And I really saw that in the end, we were able to resolve really difficult crises. And the key to them was not to polarize, however awfully it looked like people were behaving and however strong the temptation was to polarize. And my God, it was strong. I could start to see that if you polarize in any way, if you forget to be on everyone's side, you cannot really navigate the conflict in a positive way. And we did in the end, because everybody had a feeling of being one. And so I'm seeing in this situation with Zelensky, with Trump, with Putin, if you're on anyone's side more than the other, if you take sides, then conflict and war perpetuates. It's what's so brilliant about what the Dalai Lama has done in Tibet, is he saw that the important thing was not to polarize. That in a way, however difficult the sacrifice was, let China have Tibet. In the end, in the long term, better that you don't create conflict and separation, and you have compassion and understanding, then you create conflict. And I see in terms of Ukraine, then you can approach the whole thing in a very different manner. It's a bit like when you're in personal arguments or conflicts. It's very easy to see all the faults in the other person. How do you not separate and polarize with them? How do you continue to keep your heart open to them and see their situation with understanding? And I was really struck by this when I went into prison recently. And I was working with all the prisoners there, many of whom were on quite long life sentences for murder, for other crimes. And we started to talk about all of this, and the whole thing, there was about 30 of us, just opened up beautifully. And what I was really struck by was that everybody has a beautiful heart. And I was dealing with people who've murdered people, who've done terrible things, but they saw, their hearts saw how caught they'd got, how identified with all their impulses and emotions and animal instincts, and how much they regretted that, and how much everybody wanted to come from a place of unity, from love for each other. Once that you look at the situation in that light, there are no goodies and baddies. There are just human beings trying to do their best. It might be distorted by, all the emotions we all have. But how do you bring that understanding to this situation so that you see Trump, in a positive light, is trying to prevent war? He doesn't want war to continue, and that's a positive instinct. And he wants to make a relationship with Putin. That's a positive instinct. He wants to try and bring a ceasefire and bring Zelensky back together with, to create a ceasefire and to have business operating, which starts to bind people together more. Nasty shock for him, as life always does, that he thought that Zelensky would be really grateful for this and grateful for all the support from America and so on. And so he and Vance failed to make a connection with Zelensky. For Zelensky, he's desperately wanting to create a sense of unity within the Ukraine and to look after his people. And he's worried about the aggression of Russia and the oppression of his people. That's a very positive instinct. Of course he's going to feel like that. And he's coming from a positive motive to really protect and prevent people being hurt and killed and so on. And then Putin. Can we understand and care as much about him? And when you look at Putin through that lens, you see in Europe how easy it is to have a subjective bias. I remember talking to people in Eastern Europe many years ago who were very suspicious of Russia, maybe understandably, but struggled. And I was running a program where we had... for an international law firm, and we had people from Russia, from the Moscow office coming in, and we talked about this issue. And I was asking them, and I was saying, look, from what I see, for Russia, it must look very different. It must look like, here's Europe, the West, very successful, financially dominant, and I said, it must look a bit like you're in a street or a small community and all the people in the houses around you are your friends. And then a new friend comes to town who's much wealthier, very charismatic, who everyone's sort of a bit wowed by, and they go round to all your neighbors and make closer friendships with them than you. And then your closest friend who lives next door, they come along and say, come and be friends with us because we're a much better bet than Nick. He's had his day. And I can see the insensitivity in the Ukraine of coming along and taking an elected president and supporting a coup to undermine and topple him, and then imposing a sort of Ukrainian western side of Ukraine onto the situation. You can see how threatened Russia must have felt. And Russia has been losing since the 80s. And so our sense of the West, we're sort of winning financially. In many other respects, Russia was going backwards. You can see the paranoia and sensitivity that must have been in Russia. And Ukraine's like the final straw, your last close ally and friend. And half, not half, but a substantial part of Ukraine speaks Russian, has a natural connection with Russia. The talk of Ukraine joining NATO, all of those things, you can see why a figure like Putin would appeal to Russia. Somebody who has the strength to hold that. And there's something dangerous about these power blocs. Europe, Russia, America, China, that the identity with that makes other people separate. Had we taken the opportunity to involve Russia in Europe, probably none of this would have occurred, because we wouldn't have isolated Russia as somehow different or other. And I think what might therefore be emerging is that we are at a point where this sort of tribal approach won't work. Business, the internet, our global interactions have moved beyond these more tribal identifications with countries, with blocks like Europe. These physical identifications, something needs to move beyond them. And I feel like the current situation is provoking that. It's really provoking us to get the hang of a global consciousness that's beyond the current identifications with physical land and nationality, and even beyond nationality, sort of continentality, whatever that is. And I think this is interesting because it's at the heart of this whole diversity and inclusion debate, which is we all have our unique personalities and vehicles for experiencing consciousness, and we each are like cells in a body. We each have our differences, our uniqueness, at the same time that we are all part of one consciousness. If we get caught in identifying too strongly with our individual vehicles, then we separate. Then we forget we're one. How do we, in the same way, collectively recognize our interdependence, and that within that interdependence is independence as well, so that everybody feels an interdependent connection? We're all part of the whole, but we're all individual, that countries have a certain degree of individuality. But if we identify with that too strongly, we forget we're interdependent. And I think life is really calling us through this crisis to make this shift. Might take us a long time, but I think if we can see that, and enough people can see that, we begin to rise above these more these older sort of tribal identities to do with our physical location. Let's see. It's fascinating to watch it unfold.